When the skies finally quieted after the pulses of brilliant, lethal light, the world fell silent in a way no living soul had ever experienced. Cities ceased to glow with electricity. Machines that had once made our daily lives convenient became little more than twisted hunks of metal. The apocalypse arrived not in the form of mushroom clouds, but with shrieking bursts of solar flares, or perhaps an orchestrated EMP assault, no one seemed sure, and a hush descended that was almost deafening in its totality. Planes came crashing down like shooting stars. Satellites blacked out, leaving the world in darkness. In the years that followed, humanity clawed its way back to partial functionality. Steam trains replaced bullet trains. Crude mechanical pistons took the place of microchips. Flickering oil lamps illuminated the nights that had once been banished by neon and LED. Towns were rebuilt around massive coal furnaces and clumsy gear-driven vehicles. Life was strange, hardscrabble, but possible. People told stories around these new, flickering fires, passing along folk tales of horrors lurking just beyond the horizon. One of these rumors spoke of a roving machine, a behemoth that ploughed through dunes of ash and forests of twisted iron. It was said to be piloted by a solitary figure in a tarnished mask. Some claimed he wore a brass skull plate. Others swore it was a plague doctor's mask of black leather and glass. No matter the iteration, they all whispered the same name in hushed voices: the Necromancer. Rowan Larson had heard all these rumors, recounted them 1,000 times to wide-eyed children under the glare of a kerosene lamp. But stories were one thing. Standing out on the edge of the settlement, he realized how dangerously real the tales of the Necromancer might be. He leaned on a wooden fence that had seen better days. Splinters dug into his palms, but he didn't care. His gaze traveled the silent wasteland, where dark shapes of petrified trees stuck out of the earth like the broken ribs of dead creatures. Beyond that was uncharted territory, lands once mapped by satellites, now forgotten. In the distance, mechanical wails like tortured, rusted trumpets echoed through the thinning gloom. Whenever the wind shifted just right, it carried that groan. Rowan's breath caught. He couldn't pinpoint the source, only that it came from somewhere to the north, or perhaps it had changed direction. Sound in this new world played tricks, bouncing among the ruins. An old friend, Merrick, approached from behind, boots scraping the dirt. "You hear it again?" he asked. The flickering lamplight behind Merrick cast a tall, wavering silhouette across the ground. Rowan nodded. "Hard not to. It's been going on for weeks, drifting around us but never seen. It feels like it's hunting us." Merrick set a hand on Rowan's shoulder, but there was no comfort in his voice. "We'll strengthen the watch." He turned to go, but paused to add quietly, "Stay ready." And with that, Rowan was left with the howling wind and the faint metallic moan rolling across the fields of twisted iron. He could almost believe that old ghost stories were about to come howling to life. It was around a smoky tavern table that Rowan first heard the rumor that the Necromancer's machine did more than merely roam the wasteland. It harvested. According to a traveling tinker who had managed to repair an old mechanical horse cart, bodies were vanishing from small hamlets along the northern frontier. Corpses that had been laid to rest days earlier were found with their graves yawning open, caskets smashed. Sometimes there weren't even enough remains left behind to be sure it was the same person. The rumor froze the blood in Rowan's veins. "Who would steal the dead?" he asked, voice low. The tinker pulled on his pipe, mouth pulled into a grimace that highlighted the worry lines across his brow. "Not a normal bandit," he said. "Some say it's an army of ghouls, others speak of a plague. But the old-timers recall the legends. A machine rumbling through the night, driven by a man in a brass mask." A hush fell. Merrick, seated next to Rowan, caught his eye. Neither man spoke, but the memory of that strange moan on the wind hovered between them. Eventually, Rowan cleared his throat. What do you suppose it does with them?" The tinker lowered his eyes, tapped his pipe against the side of his chair. "Maybe you don't want to know. Best keep your dead close and your fences strong." Talk was cheap, but soon actual evidence surfaced. From a settlement half a day's walk, north came refugees, their faces hollow with terror. They spoke of how the wind smelled of iron and rot, how a monstrous contraption had rolled through in the dead of night, trailing black smoke. When dawn came, half their cemetery's graves had been ripped open. The living never caught more than a glimpse, but they insisted the figure that piloted the machine wore a brass mask. "It was half steam engine, half carriage," an old woman said, her voice trembling. "Huge metal treads, like the war machines of old. I swear I heard something, screaming from inside." She could hardly speak more. Tears pooled in her wrinkled eyes. Amid the quiet settlement, the hush was broken only by the snap of steam pistons from the blacksmith's workshop. Everyone realized something dreadful was coming closer. Preparations began in earnest. Merrick and Rowan led work crews to reinforce fences, dig trenches, and set up traps that would discourage a heavy, mechanical trespasser. Some of the settlement's best engineers worked on a half-functioning turret that used compressed steam to fire heavy projectiles, though no one was certain it would be enough against a machine built from lost technology. By lamplight, Rowan sharpened a rust-spotted sword, left over from some war museum. He'd never used a sword in real combat. Before the collapse, people fought with guns and drones. Now, though, with black powder in short supply, close combat with steel was again the norm. Each rasp of the whetstone calmed his nerves slightly, but the swirling rumors refused to let him rest. Reports came in, new sightings of the Necromancer's contraption in the direction of a half-buried city of old. Others whispered that a mechanical bird had scouted them from the skies. But even in those paranoid hours, Rowan couldn't quite accept that the stories of a necromancer were literal, reanimating the dead. He cast his eyes to the covered bodies near the edge of town, victims of a recent plague. The ground had grown too hard and rocky to bury them. They would need to be cremated soon. Rowan felt a sudden and visceral dread at the thought that someone, or something, might come to claim them. With a violent shudder, he went back to scraping the blade, ignoring the creeping shadows that seemed to flicker at the edges of the lamplight. It happened on a moonless night. An alarm bell's frantic tolls shattered the stillness. Rowan rolled out of bed, sword clutched in hand. He dashed into the street, nearly tripping over piles of scrap. Sparks lit the darkness where the settlement's lone steam turret fired into the black void. Shouts and screams overlapped, forming a chaotic chorus. Somewhere, a huge shape loomed against the horizon, billows of black smoke curling into the sky. Rowan sprinted toward the settlement's gate. By the flicker of lanterns, he saw the monstrous silhouette, a ramshackle mass of riveted plates, blackened wheels, and spiked gear shafts that churned through the dirt. From the top protruded a tall, spindly column. Attached to that column was the pilot's seat, a narrow cabin where a figure stood, illuminated by the faint glow of internal fires. He wore a dark cloak and a tarnished brass mask, reminiscent of a skull's visage. Tubes and wires spiraled around him, all feeding into some hidden mechanism behind his seat. The Necromancer. A turret shot smashed into the contraption's flank, sending up a burst of sparks. The machine lurched, but did not stop. Its engine belched more oily smoke. With a roar, the contraption smashed its front end into the settlement's fence line. Wooden posts splintered. Merrick stood on the ramparts, frantically loading a makeshift crossbow cannon. Rowan was about to scramble to his side when an unholy wail rose from beneath the contraption's battered steel plates. He froze, blood running cold. Emerging from compartments along the side of the behemoth machine came half a dozen figures that walked in uneven, clumsy steps. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary men, if men still moved with broken arms, twisted necks, and mechanical harnesses soldered into their pallid flesh. Some had gear-driven prosthetics that replaced missing limbs. Others displayed piston rods embedded in their torsos, pulsing as though artificially animating hearts. Their eyes were glazed or missing entirely. They advanced, moaning, the dead made to walk again. Rowan felt his throat constrict. He had prepared for bandits or a renegade war machine. But this? Corpses, animated by mechanical implants, spurred forward into battle. One of these abominations lunged across the broken fence, swinging a rusted metal claw. People scrambled back. The turret crew fired steel bolts into the undead. Some collapsed, but others continued on, ignoring gaping wounds. Rowan found himself face to face with one reanimated man whose entire jaw had been replaced by a hinged brass contraption. A black fluid leaked from his torn cheeks, and the eyes that hadn't rotted shut stared blankly. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, Rowan slashed with his sword. The blow cut halfway through the corpse's harness, and with a grotesque snap, the reanimated man collapsed. Rowan kicked it away, panting in horror. Behind the savage assault, the Necromancer continued to pilot the war machine forward. Each step it took left deep gouges in the ground. Smoke poured from the vents. The driver's mask gleamed in the flickering lights of muzzle flashes and the glow of settlement lanterns. A battered figure sprinted across Rowan's peripheral vision. Merrick, climbing down from the ramparts to join him. "We can't hold that thing off forever," he shouted over the roar of steam engines. "We have to lure it into one of our trenches or direct the turrets at it up close." Rowan nodded, mind racing. Already, the undead foot soldiers were tearing through the settlement's defenders, their stiff limbs propelled by mechanical might. Men shouted in pain and terror. Crossbow bolts sank into rotted flesh, but did not stop these horrors from swinging spiked clubs or steel prosthetics. "Distract them!" Rowan bellowed at a nearby group of armed settlers. "Push them toward the traps at the east perimeter." He caught Merrick's eye. "I'll go for the pilot. If I can get inside that thing—" Merrick's face contorted. "You'll get yourself killed." Rowan did not respond. Instead, he darted through the chaos toward the Necromancer's massive machine, sword clutched tight, heart pounding like a runaway piston. He wove around a cluster of undead, narrowly avoiding a swing from a mechanical limb. Everywhere he looked was carnage. That hideous war contraption belching black smoke, reanimated corpses marching forward at its mechanical whim. Buildings caught fire from the oil spewing off its sides. The entire settlement glowed with flickering embers against the starless sky. Rowan reached the base of the machine. Its hull soared above him, a monstrous amalgam of patchwork steel. Finding handholds on protruding rivets and hammered plating, he began climbing. The metal radiated heat. The clang of its internal engine battered his ears. Each step upward felt like a fight against the crushing stench of oily smoke. He was nearly at the top when a sudden jolt rocked the contraption. The turret must have landed another blow, but the behemoth continued forward, unstoppable. Rowan gritted his teeth and forced himself higher, up to the open pilot station where the Necromancer waited. Red sparks from the machine's core danced around the figure's form, revealing a swirl of cables and rotating brass discs that connected to the pilot's body itself. It was as if the man was plugged directly into the mechanical beast. The Necromancer turned a masked head to regard Rowan. Even at such close range, the face was inscrutable, just a brass facade in the shape of a skull. A hollow, unnatural laugh resonated through the machine's chassis. Rowan lunged, swinging his sword. The Necromancer flicked his wrist. An arc of electricity, or some strange energy discharge, crackled from a coil near the pilot's seat, striking Rowan's blade. The force knocked Rowan back, almost toppling him from the machine. Pain coursed through his arms. He managed to grip a rung to keep from falling. "It is too late," a voice rasped from behind the mask. "You cling to life in a world of rot." The Necromancer's free hand twisted a valve, and a hiss of pressurized steam roared out. The contraption lurched forward again, nearly throwing Rowan off balance. The pilot's other hand reached for something hidden in the console, some sort of mechanical lash. He flicked it, and a whip of segmented metal snapped toward Rowan's chest. Rowan barely threw himself aside, letting the metal whip strike the console, sending up sparks. Determined, Rowan steadied himself, lunged again, and knocked the pilot's arm aside with a clang. "Why do you do this?" he shouted. "What are those abominations out there?" No answer, only a twisted cackle. Over the pounding of the engine, the Necromancer's voice roiled in an otherworldly tone. "A new beginning," it hissed, "for a dead world." Suddenly, a fresh impact struck the machine. This time, Rowan felt the contraption lurch sideways. From below came a clamor of cheers. Possibly, the settlement's steam turret had hit a critical gear. Inside the cockpit, sparks rained over the Necromancer, and the pilot seemed briefly disoriented. Rowan used that opening to slash at the cables, linking the man to the machine. Metal parted with a screech. The Necromancer jerked away, a grunt echoing behind the mask. Black fluid, oily, foul-smelling, poured from the severed tubes. The machine groaned, sputtering. A huge, gear-driven wheel of the monstrous contraption snapped free from its axle, and with a thunderous crash, the entire behemoth tilted, tumbling sideways. Rowan had just enough time to throw himself off the slanting deck into a pile of broken crates below. The ground rushed up to meet him. He landed hard, nearly blacking out. Above him, the giant machine slammed to rest in a quake of twisting metal. Fire spread from its internal components, and a plume of oil-laced smoke billowed into the sky. Gasping, half blinded by the stench, Rowan forced himself to his feet. The battlefield was littered with carnage, but he could see that the reanimated foot soldiers were staggering, spasming. With the behemoth destroyed, the impetus that had driven them seemed to falter. Some collapsed entirely, others simply wandered off, mindless and directionless. Rowan's gaze shot back to the wreck. Had the Necromancer perished in the crash? Before he could investigate, Merrick rushed over, supporting a wounded comrade. "Rowan, we have to put the fires out. The entire settlement could go up in flames." His eyes flicked to the twisted shape of the war machine, the sporadically twitching undead. "We'll check for survivors after." Nodding, Rowan swallowed the sick taste of smoke and gathered a bucket, stumbling into an endless chain of water and desperation. Even as they fought to contain the flames, Rowan couldn't chase away the feeling that the Necromancer had slipped into the shadows, vanished like a nightmare, and that the horrors they witnessed were only the beginning. Dawn broke over scorched rubble and lingering plumes of oily smoke. The settlement still stood, though parts of it were blackened or smashed, but the cost was high. 12 lives lost, dozens more wounded. Amid the wreckage, mechanical corpses, reanimated men with shattered brass harnesses, lay silent at last. Rowan, weary and covered in soot, helped the survivors gather the fallen. All the while, a haunting question circled in his mind. Had they truly defeated the Necromancer, or was this only one of his machines? When they finally dared to approach the hulking ruin of the war machine, they found no human remains in the pilot's station. The seat was ravaged by fire, cables melted, but of the masked figure there was no sign, only oily footprints trailing away into the dirt. Merrick bent down to inspect them. He lived, walked away somehow. Rowan glared at the horizon, his fists clenched. "We'll track him." But Merrick let out a slow breath. "We're in no shape for a chase. Our people need help. Maybe the Necromancer won't come back soon." Shame and anger warred in Rowan's chest. He knew Merrick was right. The settlement needed every able body to recover from this ravaging. Still, the notion of letting that horror-wielding madman roam free sent fear thrumming through his bones. They salvaged what they could from the remains of the behemoth machine. Gears, rods, and twisted plating were loaded onto carts. Odd contraptions of unknown purpose were scattered within its belly, a black cylinder that hummed with residual energy, an array of mechanical arms that seemed meant for attaching implants to corpses, and rows of empty fluid vials labeled in an indecipherable script. The biggest find was a rusted steel chest lodged deep in the machine's hold. It was locked, but Rowan managed to pry it open with a crowbar. Inside lay diagrams in a strange, spidery handwriting. Runes, mechanical sketches of how to fuse cogs with flesh. Diagrams of the human body, with notes on how to replace tendons with steel cables. The Necromancer's twisted Bible. Rowan felt bile rise in his throat as he scanned the horrifying images. "He's got a system," he muttered. "A methodical approach to reanimating corpses. It's not magic. It's monstrous engineering." Merrick, leaning over his shoulder, turned green. "We need to burn it." "No," Rowan said quickly, surprising even himself. "This might help us understand him. How to stop him. Knowledge is power." Reluctantly, Merrick nodded. He turned away, rubbing his temples. They buried their dead, or burned them if the ground was too unyielding. Funerals were short and subdued, overshadowed by the knowledge that corpses, too, had become coveted by the Necromancer. The phrase, "keep your dead close," took on a new, dreadful meaning. Rowan spent hours poring over the stolen diagrams, trying to glean some vulnerability in the Necromancer's designs. He discovered references to central couplings, life steam conduits, and galvanic inductors. Each apparently played a role in animating the dead. He also noticed repeated references to a place called Arcadia Station, which seemed to be a hidden workshop or fortress, somewhere out in the wasteland. The text teased that it was in the remains of an old railway hub, but no coordinates were listed, only partial directions mentioning the red salt plains and the obsidian spire. At last, Rowan let the papers rest. His head throbbed. If the Necromancer had retreated to Arcadia Station to repair his body and perhaps build a new machine, that place was the real threat. Letting the Necromancer remain at large was unthinkable, especially after the devastation he'd just caused. But how to find Arcadia Station? In the corner of the settlement's half-rebuilt tavern, the travelling tinker from weeks before was tinkering with an old mechanical compass that used magnetized gears instead of electronics. Rowan approached, diagrams in hand. "I see references to these landmarks. Salt plains, obsidian spire. You travelled widely. Do you recognize them?" The tinker scratched his beard, eyes scanning the pages. "Aye, I've heard rumours of black glass formations in the far west, mineral extrusions from deep volcanic scars. The red salt plains might be the Great Salts. That's west of here, near the old railway corridors." "That must be Arcadia Station," Rowan decided. Merrick, who had followed Rowan into the tavern, frowned. "It's weeks of travel across dangerous territory, especially with our settlement in tatters." "Let me go," Rowan said, "with a small group. We'll track him, stop this madness at the source. He'll only come back, stronger next time." Merrick studied him, nodding slowly, as though he'd expected this. "I can spare a few men. But Rowan, if things go bad, you get out. Understood?" Rowan just clasped Merrick's arm in thanks. "We can't let him gain more corpses." The journey west began under a sky that flickered with the remnants of solar storms. Stray auroras sometimes danced overhead, even in the daytime, a remnant of the cosmic disruption that had sent civilization plummeting. Rowan led a small band of 5, each mounted on steam-assisted horses, equines fitted with mechanical leg braces, and small gear-driven exoskeletons that allowed them to travel longer distances with less rest. These contraptions were some of the more successful post-collapse hybrids, though they required a careful supply of water for their mini-boilers. Across dunes of shattered asphalt and rusted vehicles, they marched. They skirted ruined highways where half-buried trucks lined the shoulders like tombstones. The wind carried the faint tang of old decay and metallic dust. Sometimes the crackle of static would ripple across their radio-like ether horns, experimental devices that tried to pick up leftover electromagnetic signals, but mostly there was only silence. At night, they camped in the shells of crumbling buildings. Rowan pored over the diagrams again by the light of a battered kerosene lantern. He learned more details about the Necromancer's methods, how the pilot's seat tapped into something called the prime galvanic circuit, how the mechanical whips used magneto-electric fields to subdue the undead. The more he read, the more he wondered about the Necromancer himself. Was he even entirely human anymore? The notes referred to necessary self-modifications, though they were frustratingly vague. The nightmares came often. Rowan dreamed of corpses rising from a black sea, cords and wires embedded in their flesh. He dreamed of a massive engine thrumming beneath the desert, powering an army of the undead. In the dreams, the Necromancer's brass mask watched him from every shadow. After 2 weeks of hard travel, they crested a ridge overlooking a vast plain of crimson crystals, a salt flat tinted red by iron deposits. This had to be the red salt plains from the notes. Beyond the shimmering flats, black spires jutted from the earth like the shards of some colossal mirror. Steam vents dotted the horizon, suggesting geothermal activity. Abandoned railway tracks wound in a meandering path across the salt, half buried in drifts. One of Rowan's men, Taran, peered through a battered telescope. "I see the black spire. It's unnatural. A tower of volcanic glass, maybe. There's a large building near it. Maybe that's the old station." Rowan exhaled. "Arcadia Station. It fits the notes. We should approach with caution." As they ventured down into the flats, the salt crunched under the horses' hooves, the gear braces ticking softly. The air was stifling, acrid with sulphur. A sense of foreboding weighed on them, the hush of the place more ominous than any scream. Then they spotted it in the distance, a building complex with tall arches, once a grand railway hub. Now it was defaced with scaffolding of iron plates and pipes belching steam. Machinery churned inside, and a faint droning hum could be heard even at a distance. A locomotive-like shape lay on the old tracks, battered but fitted with enormous steam pistons and mechanical arms. Smoke curled from a half-dozen chimneys. All around were toppled train cars, many showing evidence of mechanical refitting. Rowan motioned the group to dismount. They hid the horses behind an outcropping of basalt. "We'll go in on foot," he said quietly, glancing around at the men who had volunteered. Each bore a mix of crossbows, crude flintlock pistols, and steel weapons. "We need to find out how many reanimated soldiers he might have here, or if he's alone." Their grim faces told him they understood. This was no ordinary raid. They might face an army of the dead. Keeping low to the ground, they approached an archway that led into a partially collapsed concourse. Faint echoes of industrial clanging and hissed steam surrounded them. Long metal rails led deeper into the structure, where overhead walkways and catwalks crisscrossed at multiple levels. Rowan motioned for Taran to circle around to a vantage point. Another man, Fielder, pointed out a side corridor that might lead to an upper balcony. They split into pairs, stepping quietly among the debris. Strange mechanical constructs littered the area, a rig for hoisting bodies onto tables, a series of half-finished metal harnesses, even a conveyor belt with straps for securing limbs. Rowan gritted his teeth at the stench of disinfectant and rot. This was a factory of nightmares. The Necromancer was building an assembly line for the dead. Through a gap in the wall, Rowan glimpsed movement. 3 undead workers in harnesses, slowly moving crates from one end of the hall to another, as if engaged in menial labor. Their flesh was leathery and pale, their movements stiff, yet purposeful, clearly guided by mechanical contraptions fused to their spinal columns. The faint rasp of pistons accompanied each step, With careful signals, Rowan and his partner Jonas skirted behind a fallen crane to avoid detection. They pressed on, searching for the main chamber. Ahead, the station's old ticket hall opened up into a cavernous space. Dozens of steam pipes coiled overhead, venting clouds of heat that gave the air a shimmer. On a raised platform near the back, they spotted a figure robed in black, a glint of tarnished brass at the face. The Necromancer. He was turned away from them, apparently focused on a hulking form that lay on a large track platform. It resembled an engine of sorts, but its shape was more monstrous, almost skeletal, with rib-like arches of steel. Along the sides of this mechanical beast, rows of harness points suggested it could carry dozens of reanimated corpses. Thick, insulated cables ran from the contraption into the floor, perhaps to tap geothermal energy below. Rowan bit back a curse. He's building a new war machine, bigger than before. The Necromancer paced around the vehicle, occasionally adjusting valves or turning cranks. With each manipulation, steam hissed and the contraption rumbled. From behind the black cloak, Rowan could see the faint glow of tubes that connected to the man's back, some unholy fusion of living nerves and mechanical wiring. Rowan's pulse thundered. He motioned for Jonas to ready his crossbow. The plan was to wait until the rest of their group could surround the chamber. Then, at a signal, they would strike, hopefully catching the Necromancer off guard. He counted slow seconds. He saw Taran and Fielder emerge on an overhead walkway, crossbows aimed down. Another pair advanced from the left with flintlocks. Rowan breathed in. Now or never. He waved for them to open fire. Arrows and bullets cut the air, slicing through steam clouds. Several found their marks in the Necromancer's cloak. The figure staggered, letting out an enraged hiss. As if in response, mechanical thrumming filled the hall, and compartments on the war machine's sides lurched open. Row upon row of harnessed corpses, strapped in place, twitched into motion. Like marionettes, they snapped upright, attached by tubes and wires. Their moans echoed in the chamber's iron rafters. Rowan sprinted forward, hoping to close the distance before the Necromancer could fully deploy his undead forces. Jonas followed, crossbow reloaded, loosing bolts at the nearest reanimated soldier. Bloodless limbs jerked, twisted, advanced. One figure dropped from its harness, swiping with a claw-like prosthetic. Rowan's sword slashed, but the soldier's mechanical chestplate held. It retaliated, striking Rowan's shoulder with enough force to bruise him through his leather armor. Gritting his teeth, Rowan tried again, aiming for the exposed cables in the creature's side. With a spurt of foul fluid, it collapsed. Shots rang out from above as Taran and Fielder fired crossbows. Jonas managed to skewer another undead soldier in the head, the force pinning it to the side of the platform. The Necromancer, though wounded, was moving with unnatural speed. He flipped a large switch on the control panel. The monstrous engine roared, powering more harnesses. Half a dozen additional corpses jerked free, unholy life surging through brass implants. "Keep them busy," Rowan shouted, running for the control panel. He had to shut this contraption down. But in his path stood the Necromancer himself, cloak swirling. The brass mask glinted with a dark and furious light. He flicked out that mechanical whip, snapping it across the floor with a crackling surge of energy. Rowan dodged, rolling behind a crate. The whip struck sparks off the metal. Jonas tried to flank the Necromancer, but was forced back by a second lash. The Necromancer advanced, imposing despite injuries. Metallic tubes on his back pulsed with each breath. Is he even human? Rowan wondered. Desperate, Rowan grabbed a stray rod of metal from the floor. When the Necromancer whipped forward again, Rowan thrust the rod up, catching the tip of the segmented lash so that it coiled around the rod. Sparks erupted, a harsh jolt traveling up the rod, burning Rowan's hands. He let out a cry but held on. He yanked back, momentarily pulling the Necromancer off balance. The Necromancer hissed, tearing the whip free, but Rowan had the opening he needed. He lunged, sword raised. Steel met brass. The Necromancer blocked the strike with a forearm guard that glowed with energy. Rowan pressed forward, determined. Behind them, the war machine rumbled dangerously. The undead soldiers were swarming, but Rowan's companions fought valiantly, trying to hold them back. Taran unleashed a flurry of bolts, taking down 3 of the reanimated horrors. Fielder and the others fired flintlocks, reloaded, fired again, attempting to whittle down the tide. Rowan glimpsed the Necromancer's eyes behind the mask, icy, inhuman, filled with malignant intellect. "This world belongs to the dead," that same rasping voice intoned, each syllable vibrating with mechanical distortion. "You refuse to yield, but all flesh yields eventually." With that, the Necromancer thrust a hidden blade from beneath his cloak. Rowan twisted aside just in time, the blade grazing his ribs. Pain flared, hot and sharp. He slashed back, catching the Necromancer's cloak, exposing glimpses of metal plating fused to the pilot's torso beneath. The Necromancer reeled, the mask tilting. Rowan saw black fluid trickle from a damaged joint in the man's side. "Your reign ends here," Rowan spat. With a final surge, he hammered the pommel of his sword into the Necromancer's mask, cracking the brass. The Necromancer stumbled backward, momentarily disoriented. Across the chamber, Taran and Jonas seized the chance. They unleashed bolts that struck the Necromancer's body. One hammered into that mechanical plating, lodging there. Another ripped a tube from his back, causing a shriek that was more mechanical static than human cry. Sparks danced across his cloak. Staggering, the Necromancer groped for the control panel. He slammed a lever downward. Instantly, the war machine shuddered, and the nearest harnessed corpses exploded in arcs of energy. The entire platform rumbled, as though building to a meltdown. "Everyone out! He's overloading it!" Rowan shouted. He sprinted back to Jonas, helping the half-stunned man over the piles of debris. Taran and Fielder fired one last volley at the Necromancer before turning to run. An explosion of steam soared upward. Gears shrieked under immense stress. In the swirling fog, Rowan saw the Necromancer step onto a side platform that led deeper into the station. With a final glare, he vanished behind hissing steam, his steps unsteady but unbroken. "We can't lose him," Rowan thought, but the roar of the failing war machine forced him to choose: chase the Necromancer or avoid being incinerated by whatever meltdown loomed. He grabbed Taran, pulling him along. "Go! We'll find him after. We survive first." They sprinted out the way they had come. The rest of the group followed, stumbling over corpses and half-assembled contraptions. Behind them, the war machine's core blew in a riot of sparks and boiling fluid, flooding the hall with scorching steam. They emerged into the relative cool of the outer corridor, hearts pounding, the hiss of escaping vapor echoing in their ears. Rowan coughed, wiping sweat and soot from his face. They had to ensure this place was fully disabled. The Necromancer couldn't be allowed to salvage any of it. They regrouped in the station's old freight yard, beneath the open sky. The meltdown had caused partial collapses in the main hall, and pillars of smoke rose where broken pipes vented superheated steam. The undead that remained outside reeled in confusion, some collapsing without the controlling signals from the Necromancer's system. Rowan leaned against a rusted railcar, wincing at his wounded side. "We need to find him before he flees," he gasped. "He knows we're here. We can't let him rebuild." Taran frowned. "But how? He's one man, and this station is huge. He could be hidden in any number of tunnels." A scream cut through the air, a high, pained wail. Jonas pointed. "Over there!" Through a half-broken wall, they glimpsed flickers of movement. Rowan steeled himself. "We go," he said, ignoring the throbbing in his ribs. "If he's cornered or wounded, now's our chance." Carefully, they clambered over heaps of debris, into a corridor that led to the station's old offices. The passages were dim, lit only by the glow of distant flames. Every few steps, they encountered abandoned mechanical parts, artificial limbs, half-assembled harnesses. It was like walking through the scattered remains of a mad doctor's lab. A nauseating smell of scorched flesh lingered. Eventually, they reached a wide doorway that opened into what must have been a workshop. A battered sign above it read, "Mechanical Repair." The inside was dim, lit by a single flickering lamp. Shadows loomed large. At the center was a table of twisted metal. Shackled to it was a living man, one of the station's unfortunate captives, or perhaps a would-be undead soldier whose transformation was incomplete. The man moaned weakly, wrists pinned by mechanical clamps, an open wound on his chest where someone had begun installing a gear mechanism around his ribs. Blood and black fluid mingled. The sight made Rowan's stomach churn with revulsion. But the real horror stood beside the table. The Necromancer, hunched over a set of tools, fiddling with a half-installed harness on the captive's spine. Evidently, even while wounded, he was determined to continue his grisly work. The mask was cracked, revealing a glimpse of burned flesh, and beneath it, mechanical plating that fused with muscle. A single bloodshot eye glared from behind the broken brass. Rowan's group froze. The Necromancer turned with a low, guttural snarl, more beast than man. Sparks arced from damaged tubes on his shoulders. A shredded portion of his cloak revealed an emaciated frame, augmented by metallic implants, some of them pulsating as if pumping fluid through artificially reinforced veins. "End this," Rowan said quietly, stepping forward, sword ready. "You have nowhere to go." The Necromancer responded with a hideous laugh that devolved into a cough, flecks of black fluid spraying from his cracked mask. With one hand, he clutched the side of the work table, but the other hand lifted a tool, a saw-like contraption with a rotating blade, still spattered with gore. "Your cause is lost," the Necromancer hissed, voice stuttering with mechanical distortion. "Flesh decays, steel endures. This is the future." The captive on the table moaned, half delirious with pain. Rowan's rage flared. "Your future is nothing but horror." He lunged, sword striking at the Necromancer's chest. The pilot tried to parry with his saw tool, but Rowan's blow cut deep into metal plating. Sparks and black fluid shot out. With a choked roar, the Necromancer lashed back, the saw whirring. Rowan jerked away, but the blade nicked his arm, drawing blood. Gritting his teeth, he struck again, aiming for the center of that twisted mass of cables in the Necromancer's torso. Taran, Jonas, and the others flanked the Necromancer, crossbows raised, but they couldn't shoot without risking Rowan. It became a deadly dance, the Necromancer stumbling from the injuries, yet refusing to fall. The rotating saw shrieked, meeting Rowan's sword in a shower of sparks. "Just die!" Rowan roared, driving the sword forward with all his might. The blade found its mark, sliding through a gap in the plating. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The Necromancer stiffened, the single visible eye wide with fury. Then came a hideous grinding noise as the sword severed core gears and cables. Black fluid and steam vented from the wound. The Necromancer's limbs spasmed. The saw slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor. Slowly, he sank to his knees, chest rattling. The single visible eye locked onto Rowan. "You cannot kill death," he rasped. A final stutter of mechanical breath escaped the tubes on his back. Then the Necromancer slumped forward, the brass mask clanging against the floor. Steam billowed around him as he lay still, that black fluid pooling across the broken tiles. No one moved for several heartbeats. Then Jonas exhaled, trembling. Taran approached, crossbow still aimed, and gave the unmoving body a slight nudge. It did not respond. A hush, heavy as the grave, settled over the workshop. The Necromancer, the terror that had plagued them, that had built an army of mechanized dead, finally lay defeated in a broken heap of man and machine. Rowan, panting, retracted his sword from the wreck of flesh and metal. His side ached, arm burned, but relief flooded him. Nearby, the captive on the table moaned again, calling them back to urgent reality. "We've got a living one," Taryn said, rushing over. "He's badly hurt." Rowan knelt to examine the battered man. There was a mechanical harness partially fused to his spine, but perhaps it could be removed. "We'll do what we can," Rowan said. "We'll get him out of here. Find a doctor in the next settlement." A final glance at the fallen necromancer stirred a swirl of emotion. Triumph, horror, sorrow for what the world had become. Could it truly be over? They carried the wounded man out of the workshop. Exhausted, they made a hasty search of the premises, destroying any equipment that might be used to continue these grim experiments. Undead bodies were destroyed, harnesses dismantled, labs set to flame. The massive meltdown in the main hall had already done half the job for them. At last, when the station lay in ruins, smoke drifting across the red salt plains, Rowan and his companions emerged into the harsh light of afternoon. They found their horses, skittish but unharmed. The wounded captive stirred, eyes flickering open. His gaze, though clouded with pain, reflected a spark of hope. With gentle hands, Jonas helped secure him on a horse's flank. Rowan turned to look back at Arcadia Station, its once proud arches sagging, steam drifting from its shattered roof. "It's done," he murmured. "We've ended his reign." Taryn rested a hand on Rowan's shoulder. "The dead can rest easier." But even as he said those words, Rowan couldn't shake a certain unease. The necromancer had boasted that he was only a herald for a new order. Was that mere mad rambling, or were there other horrors out there? They mounted up, leaving the station behind in ashes. The red salt flats shimmered, a blazing mirror of the sky. Exhausted but alive, they set their course for the home settlement, hoping that this blow would keep the nightmarish age of mechanized zombies at bay, at least for a time. It took another 2 weeks to return east. The wounded man survived, thanks to makeshift care and the will to live. They learned his name was Caldwell, once a scout who had tried to investigate Arcadia Station alone, until the necromancer's soldiers took him. As they rode, Rowan considered the swirling rumors that might fill the land once word got out that the necromancer had been slain. People would speak of how mere mortals overcame an abomination. Hope might spread. And yet, along the horizon, storms still gathered. The electromagnetic scars that had cast the world into darkness were far from healed. Ancient satellites might still tumble overhead, throwing bizarre flares. The fringe territories could hide abominations of their own. The necromancer might not be the only twisted mind capable of harnessing the reanimating science. Copies of the diagrams or shattered notebooks could remain scattered in the wasteland. Their arrival at the settlement sparked an outpouring of relief and celebration. Word travelled swiftly. Rowan and his companions had toppled the necromancer, destroyed his lair at Arcadia Station, and rescued a victim from the brink of an undead fate. Bells rang, and gatherings formed around smoky fires. People praised them as heroes who banished the nightmare from their gates. But Rowan spent those nights lying awake, haunted by the memory of that single eye behind the cracked brass mask. The bitterness, the unwavering conviction that flesh was weak and metal was eternal. The image replayed whenever he closed his eyes. Merrick noticed Rowan's restless state and offered him a seat by the communal fire. Smoke curled into the night air, and the faces of the settlement seemed more alive than ever. "You still see him in your mind?" Merrick asked gently. Rowan nodded, swallowing. "Yes, but it's more than that." In his notes, he mentioned that the mind behind the machines might live on, that the galvanic circuits can store impulses. "I fear that if someone found those designs, if someone tries to replicate his experiments—" His words trailed off. Merrick sighed, placing a hand on Rowan's shoulder. "Then we'll fight again. But for tonight, for now, we've bought peace." Rowan gazed into the fire, watched the embers dance. They had reclaimed a piece of humanity from the clutches of a monstrous dream of mechanized undeath. Perhaps the future could be built on steam and courage rather than fear and reanimated flesh. Somewhere, deep in the ruins of Arcadia Station, buried under collapsed beams and shattered machinery, lies a partially operational console, glowing faintly amidst a tangle of severed cables. A single harness stands upright, and inside it, a slumped figure, half human, half metal. A hiss of escaping steam stirs the darkness. Gears grind to life. A single eye flickers open. A whisper of static crackles across the silence. You cannot kill death.